Bonjour, bienvenue à toutes et à tous.
Good afternoon. Welcome to you all. We're going to talk about international solidarity. Has it fallen victim to the pandemic? My name is Victor Mallet. I'm with the Financial Times here in Paris, so we're going to talk about vaccines, but also economic aid, investment, and if this pandemic, has this pandemic really deepened the divide, the big divide between rich and poor, and has it deepened inequalities? So I'm going to give the floor to Ngaire Woods from the Blavatnik Government School in University of Oxford. But Xavier from the Cercle des Économistes is with me as well. Well, thank you very much, Victor. Since we have a little time, I suggest we focus on one topic, vaccines, because suffice it to say, we've seen it for ourselves. There's great inequalities in access to vaccine. A few rich countries actually have a quasi-monopoly to access to a vaccine. Let me remind you of the COVAX scheme, the COVAX mechanism, then tell you about what this mechanism was faced with and what we might be able to do in the future. So the starting point is, of course, that the point is solidarity, but it's also in our own interest to make vaccines available to all, because it's the only way to really come out of this pandemic. Hence COVAX, that was set up in 2020, promoting equal access to vaccines around the world. So the Gavi Alliance, the World Health Organizations and other institutions were set up that alliance. So the point was to get a sufficient amount of vaccines, so 2 billion doses by end of 2021. That was the initial objective that was set, but we can try to take stock of what's happened, and you'll see that it's a mixed feeling. There's the financing mechanism, so access to a vaccine for low-income countries. That fund received around $10 billion towards the end of, as of June 2021. There's 500 million coming from philanthropists and 200 million from the Gates Foundation. In terms of vaccines, what has happened? The first COVAX vaccine was delivered end of February, and 90 million doses had been sent as of July 2021. So forecasts we have indicate that COVAX should be able to meet the objective that was initially set, 9 billion doses by the end of 2021. That's good news, because we hear it said a lot that international solidarity has failed. Actually, we are in line with the initial ambition, and there's been good news in the process, but there's been bad news as well. There are new challenges on supply chains and the vaccine nationalism. Those are 2 points. More delays in the transport of doses because of a shortage of raw material. For example, I'm thinking of glass and plastic. That has happened since early 2020. Are restrictions to exports. I'm thinking of it, India, amongst producers of vaccine, and the US. So that illustrates the limitations of the COVAX mechanism, which is first and foremost a financing mechanism, which limits the close distribution. So it's not about direct subsidy to distribute vaccines, but this really the main solution would be to make it possible for production to be spread. So the point would be to subsidize production and the value chain throughout the world. So there are projections pointing to the fact that we invest a lot and get great return on investment, and a subsidy to production, being transparent in terms of value chain so as to be able to anticipate. That's one solution. Another solution is to better distribute doses that are already available in high-income countries, which is done through COVAX. 600 million doses have been put on the table by high-income countries by the end of August. And there's a challenge in this. We have to ask ourselves whether the under 19-year-olds should be vaccinated or send doses to developing countries. So to wrap up, for now, I would say that we have to increase the financial resources of the COVAX mechanism. And if you take away one figure, we've spent collectively $3,000 billion in managing the crisis. And out of this, only 10 billion for vaccination. We should probably double or triple that amount so that we could vaccinate everybody and reach collective immunity and fight variants. COVAX works, but it could be better dimensioned to serve higher ambitions. And international solidarity is also measured by the extent of efforts we're prepared to put in collectively. Thank you very much. That's a fairly unnerving figure. Thank you for this take on limits of collaboration. Olivier BABEAU, you are a lecturer at the Institute Sapiens. I think you're probably going to sound a bit more pessimistic, if I gathered what you said before. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in Aix. Sioran said Paris is a great place to despair, but Aix-en-Provence, I think, is a great place for despair. Jacques Dutronc also said that the difference between pessimists and disappointed people are that the disappointed ones have proof. Well, we're starting to have evidence. You know what Nicolas Taleb put forward into the theory is that there's only progress through unplanned events. There's something that is really tragic in COVID is that it had been predicted. The scenario of a world pandemic was in all organizations. It had been worked on. It was something that we knew was looming large, and despite of that, we got it tragically wrong. The Foreign Affairs Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, former Foreign Affairs Minister, says the future world will be the same as the previous world, but it will be worse. So it's actually exacerbated all the problems we already suffered from before, and it's made more visible these problems. Henry Kissinger says in the Financial Times, the pandemic will change forever the world order. We know because of biological evolutionism that people who have lived there have been humans for a very long time. We know that survival is a balance between solidarity and selfishness. And I think that, unfortunately, more than ever, we are caught in the dilemma of the prisoner. You know this game theory. Your interest is to cooperate because your best strategy, what will make it possible for you to gain more, is to cooperate. And even so, we reach a non-cooperative strategy. Cooperation, we can see what the point would be to fight climate change. But despite that, the preferred strategy of many countries, unfortunately, is to be to really think of yourself first, and if others put in a lot of efforts, I'd better not put in efforts myself, because I can benefit from the efforts of others. And Jean-Yves Le Drian, our Foreign Affairs Minister, and I don't worship him or anything, but he borrowed from Clausewitz. He said, pandemic is the transformation of the nation struggle. Clausewitz said that it's the continuation of struggle. Politics is the continuation of struggle and of war in other means. So we have totalitarian regimes such as China. There are illiberal regimes that are not totalitarian but authoritarian. There are illiberal democracies, Poland, Hungary, and there are aging democracies such as the US, with opposed models, as we were able to see during the pandemic. The capacity to impose very stringent decisions very quickly to control population gave an advantage, unfortunately, to the least liberal regimes, and the more liberal regimes have had to deal with the difficulty to reach a consensus and to have adhesion. Do you know the Merton effect, the Matthew effect, polarization? So the ones that had very little don't have anything anymore, and the ones that had more have even more than ever. So this has been exacerbated. If there's one solution, and I'll stop with this, is interdependency. How did we stop war in Europe? We had a great idea, which was to make all of us mutually dependent, and we set up the European Community for Coal and Steel. If you depend on one another, you can't be at war with one another. Well, I think this is the way to go for nations to become absolutely dependent on one another, or for those interdependencies to be asymmetrical. That's to say, if some are more dependent on others than on some than others. So could this be a solution to this disorder and absence of solidarity? Listening to what you said, we should cooperate, but we do the opposite, and it's a tragedy. Well, we have a few participants following this remotely, so I'm going to give the floor to Gargee GHOSH from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I think she's in Oxford right now, or I don't know where she is. Probably in the US. And she is going to tell us about multilateral challenges. I hope you hear us. Gargee GHOSH, over to you.
Thank you. Greetings from the U.S. It's early on the West Coast. I hear you well. I don't see you. Well, first of all, I think we knew from the beginning multilateralism and cooperation would be absolutely critical to ending this pandemic. And we've seen mixed reviews, as others have said already. We had all the ingredients and evidence that cooperation would be the fastest and least destructive way out of the pandemic. Whether you look at that epidemiologically, we knew that a kind of coordinated global distribution of vaccines, starting with frontline workers and healthcare workers and moving on to less vulnerable populations around the world, would be the best way to minimize variants to tackle the pandemic. And we knew economically that the coordinated, given the kind of interconnected nature of industries, the coordinated lifting of restrictions would be economically beneficial. It's probably not a surprise to many on this listening and on this panel that multilateral coordination turned out to be easier in areas of mutual benefit and harder in areas of mutual or strategic competition in a zero-sum area. So we saw collaboration on science. It's part of what led to not one, but several new vaccines being developed in record-breaking time. We saw collaboration in the setup of COVAX and of the ACT-A partnership to distribute and coordinate a response. But we didn't see that level of solidarity continue when it was clear that vaccines would be an incredibly scarce resource for some amount of time. And that has led to the situation we find ourselves in now where 80% of the 2.5 billion vaccine doses administered have gone to just a handful of countries and people around the world, leaving especially low and low middle income countries vulnerable. So, my 12-year-old in the US will be vaccinated before my aging family in India. And that's the reality. There are a few areas that I'm worried about now, and I would say the opportunity and the obligation we have now is to learn from the errors of the past year and really focus on where collaboration and solidarity will bring to an end the pandemic that currently still rages. The first concern, I think, is that we start to see pandemic fatigue and distraction as some countries make progress on their own vaccination. We're all desperate to stop talking about COVID, get back to life as we knew it, and the risk, of course, is that it becomes a pandemic of poor countries. We can't afford that for the damage it will do to lives and livelihoods, and for the epidemiological reason that we are not done with this thing until we truly have it under control everywhere. So critical to keep momentum, keep attention on getting doses out there, sharing doses, continuing to ramp up vaccine production so that this does become a global response. Second, we will not be in a acute constraint on vaccines for too much longer. It is a terrible situation that we find ourselves in now, but we know that supply forecasts suggest this is a matter of months before we will have much greater supply. And at that point, delivery and distribution will become critical. This is the largest mass vaccination campaign we've seen, not just children, but adults. And the distribution will become a rate-limiting step. So how we are preparing now to support healthcare workers, should be on all of our minds now. That is the next opportunity for collaboration and support. And finally, looking ahead, what are we learning today for vaccine manufacturing in the future? As others have said already, the location of manufacturing facilities became a question of nationalism, of geopolitical interest. It's not wrong, it's perfectly rational. How do we learn from that to make sure we have distributed capability, both for the continued control of COVID and for future pandemics, and that is a key area we're looking at now. Thank you.
Merci Gargee GHOSH pour cette intervention. Maintenant.
Thank you very much, Gargee GHOSH. And now we're going to listen to Dominique from Terega. It's a gas infrastructure company. So you're going to give us your take from the vantage point of the industry and what private companies can do to help with the solidarity. Yes, exactly. I think there's one aspect that we tend to underestimate. It's a role that the corporate world can play. There's the role of the corporate world and the role of individuals. So why am I talking about companies and the corporate world, because this crisis has revealed that we all suffer from the same problems. I'm a member of something that nobody has heard of, Business at OECD, which is sort of the entity representing private companies before the OECD, and we've never converged so much and we've never done so much in terms of stimulus for the industry. Why? Because we need to be able to operate. We need to be able to function. A company, if it's had to stop part of its operations, it needs to share experience, share feedback with other companies, between companies that are members of federations that are with the OECD. But I would say first and foremost, you can rely and you can count on companies. We want, of course, the world to go on functioning. So faced with a crisis such as one, free movement of people and goods has to be promoted. So private companies are promoters of this. There are employees, lots of employees that have had their jabs in France, but in India they haven't had their jabs. Could you not push for employees in India to get their jobs, because companies act as drivers, not only from an economic but also from a health perspective. We've all been hit in the same way. Look at French society and compare it with a country that is really hit very hard at the moment by the pandemic. If you talk with the French, they will understand what this country is now experiencing. Whereas if you talk about hunger in the world, they don't feel they can really relate. So you can leverage this, which brings me to another proposal. Yeah, we're all on the same boat, yeah? Yes, so we can all understand. So the pandemic is, of course, the topic number one, so we need to come out of this pandemic. But we also are all faced with facing climate change. And when you're not sure whether the system works or not, you have to call it into question and decide whether you should not change certain things, which brings me much closer to what's happening on the ground. We have to make sure that the Keynesian mechanisms, so shall we pile on debt or rethink our investments? Well, I think these the solutions are very much lie in partnerships. Partnerships, which is about supporting and not only massively injecting funds for international solidarity. And I recommend breaking the thermometer, if I can put it like that, or breaking the system as it exists. I'm not saying we won't need international organizations. Actually, we'll need them more, possibly, and to be more visible. But we need partnerships, ad hoc partnerships, where there's a need for digital transition, energy transition. Practically speaking, we invest in Eritrea to bring water supplies so as to counteract greenhouse gas emissions. So this will be, I think, part and parcel of solidarity in the future, even more than it is today. Thank you very much. Dominique, well, we'll follow your call over to Luis Alberto Moreno from the Allen & Co Bank. He's a former diplomat and former member of the Colombian government, and he was also the head of the Inter-American Development Bank. I think you are now in Washington, but maybe you could tell us about how things look, thinking of Latin America, how has Latin America faced, and what of international solidarity?
Well, good morning from Washington, and good afternoon. Would love to be there in ISU, which is such a wonderful forum and a great place to be. But let me just say that you know, the headline is from Latin America is very troubling because we have about 8% of the population, and currently over a third a third of the deaths in the world, with close to 1.3 million as of today and 37 million cases. And this issue of vaccines that has been talked about, essentially we are suffering what most emerging countries are suffering, which is that the access to vaccines means that we will be seeing a lot of these different modalities of new viruses. We're in the Delta, will be, I imagine, not long from now in the Epsilon kind of variant. And we're at a point where only about a third of the population has been vaccinated at least once. There are tremendous challenges that you see. Latin America is perhaps one of the most urbanized regions of the emerging world. Close to 75% of the population lives in cities. But the reality is that the choices for a good part of the population, like happens everywhere in the emerging world, is one in which people who are in the formal labor markets, in the so-called cash economy, have to make a choice. Do they eat or they go to work? And yes, there's been a tremendous amount of fiscal stimulus, but with limits. There's countries who've been able to do, like Brazil or Chile or Peru, tremendous fiscal stimulus that prevented the coming down of the economies, but more importantly, to create some kind of social safety nets. That wasn't the luxury of many countries. I would say that the amount of fiscal stimulus on average was no more than 4% in a region with about 630 million people. So what the challenges towards the future certainly are going to be, because as has been said here in the panel before, the pandemic was not a surprise event. We knew it was coming. We had seen what had happened with other type of pandemics, certainly not in this hemisphere, but had been in Asia for some time, from SARS, H1, etc. And therefore, the preparedness for the future is going to be central. And here, the question of where vaccines are produced is going to be critical. And years ago, in the days of polio, many countries had their own production capabilities, and they were rolled up because vaccines were widely available. Today, the reality in a country like mine, Colombia, where normally you would vaccinate about 8 million people a year, the reality is that with COVID, you have to have a process of vaccination that is at a minimum 5 or 6 times bigger. And this presents equally a very big challenge. And here, in the final analysis, what we've seen is that, the science is clear, is direct. People know and knew and had advised of this. The politics of how to deal with COVID has been very different throughout the world. And this is no exception in Latin America. Some countries were able to, like Chile, to ramp up significantly the amount of vaccinations, but they were at times perhaps too early to reopen, and that brought back cases of increased COVID cases. Today, the situation in Latin America is worse in terms of COVID cases than it was almost 18 months ago, back in March of last year when it started. So these are the challenges that we are facing. And I think the solution, like has been said by others, requires a global solution, a true global solution. Absent that, we will only be living with pandemics that will last in time far more. And as a result, we'll have the consequences of tremendous disparities and income inequalities within countries and amongst countries. I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Merci, Luis Alberto, et bienvenue.
Thank you, Luis Alberto, and welcome to our last speaker, Ngaire Woods, from the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, who's speaking to us from Oxford. She's going to be speaking remotely. I believe she's going to be talking about the role of the private sector, like Dominique did. How can we come back to the solidarity that we had when we created the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations many years ago? Ngaire, the floor is yours.
And hello to everybody. I'm very sorry I can't be in Aix-en-Provence. 3 big issues for global solidarity. The first is the goals. do we really have a goal to vaccinate the whole world or not? You don't reach the moon or Mars by saying, let's see if we can get halfway there. And the kind of commitment and goals that we saw in 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals and then with the Sustainable Development Goals in the United Nations were the product of absolutely visionary leadership, tough diplomacy, building coalitions, pushing the goal through. And what I would add to what's been said today is the private sector has to come to that table. When all others are making huge sacrifices in the name of public health, we do have to talk about the vaccine companies like Pfizer, whose vaccine started at $74 and has gone up and up in price, on track to make the company $50 billion out of a year or so of this pandemic. The AstraZeneca example shows that a vaccine company can make, at cost, $2 or $3 a dose, make it possible for the world to achieve vaccinations for everybody within a year. So for me, that's number one, a clear goal led by leaders. And it's got to go further than we saw the G7. The G7 told us they had agreed to 1 billion donations of vaccines. It turned out it was only 870 million. It's not clear they will succeed. That's saying let's get halfway towards the moon, and you don't reach the moon with that goal. Second thing we need, institutions. Dominique mentioned that we should be using ad hoc coalitions. That's all very well, but actually what we saw in this pandemic is we need a World Health Organization to share information and disseminate it across countries. It needs improvement, yes, but those arrangements have taken 100 years to build, so let's make sure we keep them and improve them. We've got the institutions to finance the effort in the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks. Now it's about using them. We've got the infrastructure. We don't need some great global governance reform. We simply need political leaders to actually lead and use those institutions and sweat their balance sheets. And third, we need national actions that show solidarity. And here I just want to mention that this pandemic has reached the poorest countries of the world because the wealthiest countries of the world failed to take measures quickly enough to contain it. They failed to take those measures because they were trying to protect their own economies. So here at the Blavatnik School at Oxford, we've been looking at matching the strains of virus, the spread of them, and the G20 countries. The G20 countries I would describe as the super spreaders. Having spread the infection across the world because they wanted to protect their own economic health, they now have a responsibility to clean up around the rest of the world. So all the more power to global solidarity through goals, institutions, and national actions. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Nari. Et maintenant, je vous invite...
Thank you, Nari. If you have questions, I invite you to raise your hands in the room or online. But I'd like to come back to a few things that were said. And the most important question, we've heard Gargee GHOSH talk about pandemic fatigue. Everyone's sick of this. We want to think about something else. And Nari said that we won't reach Mars or the moon if we're only trying to get halfway there, if that's our only objective. And you, Xavier, said, you gave this extraordinary figure, $1 billion spent by rich countries, $1,000 billion spent by rich countries on vaccines. So my question is this: what can we do tangibly to improve international solidarity from the economic side with debt relief? Or should we just send vaccines? Or do we ensure that the vaccines can be produced in Africa, for example? What can we do tangibly to help? And I'll ask everyone this question because I'm sure you all have solutions you'd like to put forward. This is a very important and wide question. I'm going to choose a priority. The challenge is vaccination again and again. We need to get out of the phase that we're currently in, and it's not too late to act. As I said earlier, we can't say that international solidarity did not exist. The COVAX measures exist and are on the rails to meet their initial objective. They've been undersized. We need to multiply by 4 the COVAX objectives, and that's a target that we could set. We can invest directly in the supply chain. There are tangible proposals on the table for this from Michael Kramer. One problem that is a deeper one, that's a problem that impacts us all here in this room, the question of public opinion in developed countries. Do they really take into account the importance of vaccinating the entire world so that we can all be safe? I don't believe that this is something that touches us all in the way that it should. And perhaps we need to worry more about we worry more about our children being vaccinated here. The resources exist in developed countries to go from 10 billion to 50 billion for COVAX. And this is not just a question of solidarity. It's in the interest of all of us. Olivier, Hegel says in his dissertation, if history teaches us one thing, is that we never learn anything. We never learn anything from history. And so the question, you're always very pessimistic. Okay, I was told to play the bad cop, and I'll play the bad cop role fully. There are some encouraging things that have happened. If in future we have another virus that arrives, the next pandemic, will we have progressed? Will we react more quickly? Will we react together? Will we be able, in some regimes, to say immediately, what's the problem? Can we be transparent to solve the problem early? Will we stop the exchange of people sooner at the right time? Okay, I'll be a bit optimistic. In Europe, we started really badly. We missed every opportunity. In France, the masks. We were fighting on the tarmac when the planes landed to get masks because the others were buying when the planes landed. And we were fighting against Americans and also between Europeans. We messed up on the tests, and we also messed up on our vaccinations. But finally, we have a common path towards a common budget. So health was not part of European prerogative. So they got locked in their ivory towers of bureaucracy. But I believe that we have a chance to learn lessons, but we need the feedback. We need to study what happened, because the real drama of this is that we knew that there would be a pandemic. It was a possible scenario. So how did we mess up so badly? And we need to carry out that analysis. Gargee GHOSH, I would like to ask you, is it technically and financially possible to ensure that we can roll out vaccinations quickly enough for everybody? Are there limits, industrial limits right now to this?
As products become licensed for emergency use, and that constraint has severely limited the ability of COVAX to procure. We also see that countries have had to respond to extensive outbreaks. India, obviously, is a case in point. That is a moment in time, and we are seeing production ramp up. And I believe COVAX is ready. They have released a supply picture that is much more positive, even by the end of the year. And I think the financing is there to start. But as Ngaire and others have said, we will need the world to come together again to complete the job. To your other question of kind of what is the priority now, I'm grateful my colleagues on the panel have spoken about two critical priorities, vaccination today and preparedness for tomorrow. I want to add a third, and that is around financing the recovery, financing the climb back out of the setbacks that we've seen this year. You know, we haven't talked too much about the, the order of magnitude less that low-income countries have been able to mobilize to weather the shocks of this crisis compared to the US, Europe. But we've seen the effects of that. We've seen, basic immunization set back 25 years in a matter of weeks. We've seen a rise in maternal mortality. We've seen a rise in domestic violence. And so the work that we had been progressing on for the SDGs has just become much harder. And I think this is the other front in which we now need global solidarity. So movements like the issuance of special drawing rights, the need for an accelerated IDA replenishment, all become critical and absolutely critical as we start to get back on track, both from a human capital perspective and the lives and livelihoods of people in countries. So that would be my sort of addition to the list of critical opportunities for global cooperation.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Luis Alberto Moreno. Gargee asked the question about the financing of the economic recovery plan. What do we need to do that? Luis Alberto Moreno, are you still there? Yes. Oh, he can't hear anything. Did you hear the question?
I can't hear. Can you hear me now? I cannot hear. I don't know if you hear me.
So we can hear you, but apparently you cannot hear us.
Now I'm hearing you.
Oh, okay. So the question is, how can we finance the economic recovery? Gargee, GHOSH talked about this. It's the next stage. How is this going to work for Latin America, even if we don't get enough vaccines in order to solve the pandemic problem quickly? There will still be the problem of the economic recovery for everybody. It's underway in Europe, but I think it hasn't started in other parts of the world.
The million-dollar question. The reality is that, yes, we're going to have to find a way, to only finance this recovery. But not unlike the rest of the world, certainly with the contraction of close to 8% last year, many countries, especially with what's happening in the U.S. economy that has a tremendous effect on Latin America, but equally the Chinese economy that is ahead of most other economies in terms of getting out of the consequences of COVID. That's all helping in the way of raising, for instance, prices of both mineral commodities and food commodities, as we have seen. But you also have the counter effect, which is that you're already seeing inflation pressure as they pass through many of our economies. And that has led countries like Brazil and, for that matter, other countries in the emerging world to have to begin to raise interest rates. But yes, we will have a recovery this year that is going to be close to 5%. So if you look at a contraction of 8% last year, that means that we're still not recuperating even from what happened before. But the social dimension of this are tremendous. I mean, Latin America was able to truly advance in terms of reducing extreme poverty, in terms of seeing close to 70 million people, that's more than 10% of the population in a space of less than 10 years, to move out of poverty and into the middle class. That, unfortunately, has slipped as a result of the pandemic. Coupled with the fact that you have these tremendous effects in the jobs market, and that means tremendous dislocations. Many companies around the world, like in Latin America, the effects were to ration a lot of their capacity, with consequence in loss of jobs, despite the fact that there were a lot of government incentives precisely to keep jobs. But this has been a major issue in Latin America. So we're coming out of this poorer with more unemployment, and it's going to require a way to bridge this situation in a way that the governments can have the kind of investment that can keep growth going. And that's going to be the challenge, and do it in a way that in the final analysis can have some kind of fiscal balance. So these are going to be, I think, the challenges to the future. They're probably going to mean in many countries increases in taxation. This is perhaps not the time to do it until you're totally out of the woods, but it's going to require to have a higher taxation to be able to for much of this. And it is also an opportunity, if countries can do it right, to do many of the resets that are needed in the way of the structural reforms that are so central to increase economic growth, and especially these are countries that are going to depend to a large degree on how much they can increase their trade and in what areas.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. There's some questions in the hall. We have very little time left. At the back of the room, there's a gentleman. A quick question, please. We have very little time left.
Mrs. GHOSH, she mentioned the need for more international financing for solidarity and development and reaching the SDGs goal. But isn't there some risk of kind of international retrenchment in the medium long run, where when developed countries will need to face the repayment of their current debt and engagement to face the COVID? So in that situation, do you see more demand for organizations like yours, private foundations, to substitute for government financing of international solidarity? Thank you.
OK, merci. Une réponse très brève, Gargee GHOSH, s'il vous plaît.
So a very quick answer, Gargee, please, Gargee GHOSH.
Possible that organizations like ours substitute for public finance, nor should we. I think the role of philanthropy is much more in taking the risk, catalyzing the partnerships and action that is hard for public money to do. We will need public funding, both development assistance and beyond that, to respond to this cause. There are certain types of needs that are oriented toward concessional finance. When we look at primary healthcare systems, when we look at sort of basic human development needs, that is where we need domestic public finance, ODA. And then when we look at some of these more public-private or revenue-oriented needs, like the international manufacturing system we talked about, I think there we're looking at different kinds of money, research and development funding, public-private funding. And so there is a sort of stack that you see developing that is much more feasible when you start to get into the details of needs and sources.
Merci, merci Gargee GHOSH.
Thank you very much for that answer, and I think we only have time for one more question. Thank you for your presentations, but given the international dilemmas, like how to redistribute the remaining doses of vaccine between developed countries and the least developed countries, what criteria are you using for the distribution of vaccines? So the question is how to share the doses that are left. How can you decide at an international scale how you're going to redistribute? So maybe Mary Woods would like to answer this?
Sure. Now that so many more vaccines are coming online, there is no reason why we cannot vaccinate the whole world. And the question then is how to finance it. We've got exactly institutions built after the Second World War to make sure countries don't take measures which destroy others' prosperity. We need to use those. Let's remember, Europe, Britain, its debt was 250% of GDP after the Second World War. And what did it do? It did not do austerity. It invested in schools, economic growth, national infrastructure, the National Health Service. There's a great risk that Europe, instead of taking up the investment playbook, as the United States is doing, will be tempted to grab the austerity playbook coming out of this. And that will make vaccinating the world and building back in a net zero way impossible.
Merci. Malheureusement, le temps est écoulé.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and so I'm going to hand the floor to Xavier JARAVEL for the conclusions. And you can perhaps tell us if the danger is that this pandemic is making us blind to the other crises that are impacting us, like global warming. I'm going to be extremely brief. There was Jean Monnet said that Europe was built of a crisis, and Europe will be the solutions provided to a crisis. International solidarity is one thing. We have seen solutions. They were not they didn't meet the challenge. But regardless, what was done was impressive. It required global cooperation, and I think that the public opinion has an important role to play to encourage leaders in developed countries to contribute more to the international effort. Thank you to everyone and to our panelists and our panelists who participated remotely. Thank you to everyone.
Bye-bye.